Okay, in this video, we're going to be talking about Gauss Jordan elimination or reduced row echelon form. This is going to be very similar to what we did in our last video and the method that we used in that video. It says by continuing to apply elementary row operations to the row echelon form of the augmented matrix, you can write the matrix in reduced row echelon form. And I do want to point out that on the left side, you have your identity matrix. Then you have your ABC, which is going to be what everything is equal to, and there is your equal sign that I normally put. This is useful because back substitution will not be needed. Once a matrix is in reduced row echelon form, we know that X is A, Y is B, and Z is C, because you could actually take and rewrite this. This says 1X is equal to A, 1Y is equal to B, and 1Z is equal to C. Transforming an augmented matrix to reduced row echelon form is called Gauss Jordan elimination, named after Carl, Frederick, Gauss, and Wilhelm Jordan. Okay, example number 1 says solve each system by Gauss Jordan elimination. So let's first write this as an augmented matrix. And from here on out, the steps are going to be identical to what we did. Those elementary row operations, what we did in the last section. However, we do have a little bit more to do. We're going to make this a 1, use it to make everything below it a 0. And where it changes is we're going to make this into a 1 then. Instead of just making this a 0, we're going to make both of these zeros. Then we're going to make this a 1, and we're going to make both of these into zeros. And let's start out, since we've got our 1 right here, let's make everything below it into a 0. So to make this a 0, we're going to do -2 times our 1 up there. We're going to add it to row 2. So row 1 and 3 stay the same. And row 2 turns into, we're going to multiply by -2 and add it. That's a 0. Times -2 gives me -2, and -1 is -3. 2 and 1 gives me 3. 12 and 3 gives me 9. Next up, we're going to use the 1 now to make this into a 0. And the way that we're going to do that is by multiplying our first row by 1. So row 1 times 1, which is just row 1, and we're going to add that to row 3. Rows 1 and 2 stay the same. And row 3 turns into, when we add them together, this will be a 0. This will be a -4. -1 and -3 is also -4. And then -6 and -4 is a -20. So now that we've got that finished, our first column completely finished, we're now going to turn this somehow into a 1. The way we're going to do that is -1/3 times row 2. Rows 1 and 3 will stay the same. And row 2 will turn into a 0, a 1, a -1, and a -3. Next up, we're going to use that 1 to make everything above it and below it, not just this right here, but also everything above it a 0. So therefore, in order to turn this into a 0, we're going to use this 1. We're going to multiply row 2 times -1. We're going to add that to a row 1. Again, that does not change rows 2 and 3. And row 1 turns into, this stays a 1. When you multiply by -1 and add it, that gives me -1 and 1, which is 0. +1 and -1, which is also 0. And then 3 and -6, which is a -3. Okay, next up, we're going to use that exact same 1, and we're going to make everything below it a 0. So we're going to multiply 4 times that 1 in row 2, and we're going to now add it to row 3. So rows 1 and 2 stay the same. Now row 3 turns into, when you do 4 times 0, add it to 0, stays 0. 4 times 1 and -4 gives you a 0 there. 4 times a -1 here is -4, and -4 is a -8. 4 times -3 is -12, and -20 is -32. Next up, we're done with our second column now, so let's move on to our third column, and let's try to turn this into a 1. The way we're going to do that is -1/8 times row 3. So rows 1 and 2 stay the same. And now let's work on row 3. 1/8, -1/8 of everything turns this into 0, 0. It remains 0, 0. This will be a 1, and this would be a 4. So now we're nearly finished. All we like now, we've got our 1 there. We just need to make this into a 0. The way we're going to do it, we're going to multiply row 3 times 1, which is the opposite of this. So 1 times row 3, which is just row 3, and we're going to add that to row 2. It's only going to change row 2, so rows 1 and 3 stay the same. And row 2 turns into, when you do 0 and 0, stays 0, 0 and 1 stays 1, 1 and negative 1 turns into 0, and 4 and negative 3 turns into a positive 1, and you are finished. If you were to write this back as a system, it would be x equals negative 3, 1y equals 1, and 1z is equal to 4. So pretty much you can look right here and you will know that your answers are negative 3, 1, and 4. Okay, example number 2. First step, let's go ahead and write our augmented matrix. And we now need to somehow get us a 1 here. And I notice in my second row, I've already got a 1 there. So let's go ahead and just interchange row 1 and row 2. So row 1, we're going to swap with row 2. So here's our new matrix. Okay, next up, we're going to use that 1 to make this a 0 and eventually this a 0. Now, I want to go ahead and show you something new, that you can actually combine these steps to save you a little bit of time. Why not go ahead and make both of those 0 in the same step instead of rewriting your matrix over and over? So in order to make this 2 into a 0, we're going to take this 1, we're going to multiply by negative 2, and we're going to add it to it. So we're going to do negative 2 times row 1, and we're going to add it to row 2. Well, after that, in the next step, we would go ahead and make this a 0. Well, why not go ahead and do it in the same step? So the way we would do it is we're going to take that same 1, and we would multiply it by the opposite of this, which would be 1. So we'd do 1 times row 1, and we would add it to row 3. And again, we can do both of those in the exact same step to save us a little bit of time. So the only thing that remains the same here would be our row 1. And now let's change our second row. The way we're going to do it is we're doing everything in row 1 times negative 2 and adding it to it. So we have negative 2 and 2, which would be 0, 6 and 2, which would be 8, 2 and negative 6, which is negative 4, and negative 60 plus 0, which is negative 60 right there. Now let's go ahead and do this step and change our third row as well. So we're going to do 1 times 1 and add it to negative 1, which gives us a 0. Negative 3 and 2, which is a negative 1, negative 1 and 5, which is a 4, and 30 and negative 26, which is a 4 as well. So we're done with our first column. So next thing we need to do is we need to turn this into a 1. Well, I do notice that we could interchange our second and third rows here, because we have a negative 1 right here, and it's very easy to make that a positive 1 without even having to rewrite anything. Let's go ahead and take our third row and multiply, and you can even put it out here if you want to, negative 1 times row 3. And that's going to turn this into a positive 1, a negative 4, and a negative 4. Now let's go ahead and interchange row 2 with row 3. So row 1 is going to stay the same, and here's our new matrix. And hopefully doing that, that way will get us, keep us away from the fractions a little bit longer. So I've got my 1 right here. So let's use it to make this a 0. And the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to do 3 times row 2, and I'm going to add it to row 1. And let's go ahead and make this a 0 in the same step. So use the same 1. I'm going to do negative 8 times row 2, and I'm going to add it to row 3. So the only thing that stays the same is going to be our second row. And now let's change the other 2. We're doing 3 times row 2 and adding it to row 1. So 0 and 1, which is 1. 3 and negative 3, which is 0. Negative 12 and negative 1, which is negative 13. And negative 12 and 30, which is 18. Now in the exact same step, let's go ahead and erase these, and let's change our third row. So negative 8 times row 2, and we're adding it to row 3. So that'd be a 0. Negative 8 and 8 would be a 0. 32 and negative 4 would be a 28, and 32 and negative 60 would be a negative 28. So now we're done with our entire second column, and nearly done with the rest of it. Let's go ahead and let's now make this a 1 by doing 1/28 row 3. So that will not change anything except for row 3, so rows 1 and 2 stay the same. And now my row 3 is turned into a 0, a 0. When you multiply this by 1/28, you get a 1 and a negative 1. So now we're going to use that 1 to make everything above it a 0. So we're going to do 4 times row 3, and we're going to add it to row 2 to make this 0. We're going to do a 13 times row 3 and add it to row 1 to make this a 0. So row 3 stays the same. And now let's change the other two. We'll do this one first. So 13 times row 3, add it to row 1, gives me a 1, gives me a 0, gives me another 0, and then 13 times negative 1 is negative 13, and 18 gives me a 5. So now let's go ahead and do row 2 by performing this operation. So 4 times row 3 plus row 2 gives me a 0, a 1, and a 0, which is exactly what I want. And then negative 4 and another negative 4 is a negative 8. So here, therefore, here is my x, y, and z. My answer will be 5, negative 8, and negative 1. Okay, example number 3. Again, first step, let's go ahead and write it as an augmented matrix. Now that we have it as a matrix, again, first step is we need to turn this into a 1. So we could actually just go ahead and swap row 1 with row 3, and row 2 will stay the same. We are now going to use that 1 to turn this and this into zeros. So in order to turn the negative 1 to 0, we're simply going to do 1 times row 1. We're going to add it to row 2. To turn this into a 0, we're going to do negative 3 times row 1 and add it to row 3. So therefore, row 1 will stay the same. And now let's change the other two. 1 times row 1, add it to row 2 is going to give us a 0. Negative 5 and negative 1 is a negative 6. Negative 1 and 2 gives me a positive 1. Negative 15 and negative 1 gives me a negative 16. Now to change row 3, we're going to do negative 3 times these and add it to these. Negative 3 and 3 gives me 0. 15 minus 12 is a positive 3. Positive 3 and negative 6 gives me a negative 3. And a 45 minus 27 gives me 18. So now I'm finished with my first column. Let's move on to the second column. So I need to turn this into a 1, and that's pretty ugly because I'd have to do negative 1/6, which would give me a fraction here and here. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to turn this into a 1, and I'm going to switch those two rows just to where I don't have to deal with as many ugly fractions. So to turn this into a 1, let's just go ahead and do 1/3 row 3, because again, notice there will be no fractions when you do that. So rows 1 and 2 stay the same. And when you do 1/3 row 3, it gives you 0, 1, negative 1, and 6. Now we can go ahead and interchange row 2 and row 3. So row 2, we're going to switch with row 3, and now we don't have to worry about the fractions. So here's your new matrix. Now I'm going to use that 1 to turn these two values into zeros. So I'm going to do 5 times row 2, and I'm going to add that to row 1. To turn this into a 0, I'm going to do 6 times row 2 and add it to row 3. So row 2 is going to stay the same. Okay, now I'm going to perform the other two operations to get my zeros. So we're doing 5 times row 2 and add it to row 1. So it's 0 and 1. This will be 5 and negative 5. Negative 5 and negative 1 would be negative 6. 30 minus 15 would be a 15. Now let's do this one. 6 times row 2 and add it to row 3. Let me go ahead and erase these back. So 6 times this added to this gives me a 0. 6 and negative 6 is 0. Negative 6 and 1 is a negative 5. 36 minus 16 is 20. So we're done with our second column. Okay, next up, we're going to get a 1 in the third column right here. And very easy to do that. We're going to do negative 1/5 times row 3. So rows 1 and 2 stay the same. And row 3 is going to turn into a 0, 0, 1, and negative 4. So we see there what our z value is equal to. We now use that 1 to make everything above it a 0. So we're going to do 1 times row 3, and we're going to add it to row 2. We're going to do 6 times row 3, and we're going to add it to row 1. So our row 3 stays the same. And let's do this one first. 6 times row 3, add it to row 1 to give you a 1, a 0, and a 0. Negative 24 plus 15 will be a negative 9. Let's go ahead and erase my arrows here, and let's go ahead and do my second row. Let's do this one. 1 times row 3 and add it to row 2 gives me a 0, a 1, and a 0, which is what I needed. And then negative 4 and 6 gives me a positive 2. So therefore, my ordered triple answer is negative 9, 2, and negative 4. Example number 4, step number 1, get your augmented matrix together. Luckily, I already have my 1 right here where I need it. So we're going to use that to zero everything below it out. We're going to do 2 times row 1 and add it to row 2. We're going to do negative 3 times row 1 and add it to row 3. And that's going to give me zeros everywhere below that 1. So my first row stays the same. And now let's go ahead and do my second row. So 2 times the first row and add it. So we're going to do 2 and negative 2 is 0. 4 and 4 is 8. Negative 6 and 8 is 2. Negative 28 and negative 32 is a negative 60. Okay, now my third row, we're doing negative 3 row 1 and add it to row 3. So negative 3 and 3 gives you 0. Negative 6 and negative 1 is a negative 7. 9 and 4 is a 13. 42 minus 29 is a 23. So we're done with our first column. Now let's work on our second column. So now we have an issue. We've got to somehow get a 1 here. And we can get it out of either one of these. Now, in the previous ones, we've been multiplying by things or swapping rows or something, but I don't see any way we can do that here. But there is a third trick. You can use one of these methods over here to get it as long as you don't use this number. But look at this. If I were to actually add these two together, that gives me a 1 there. So I can actually do, because of the 0 being here, it's not going to change this. I can do 1 times row 3 and add it to row 2. And that's going to give me, again, a 1 right there. So rows 1 and 3 does not change, but we are going to change row 2. Now, this is not the only method of doing this. You can work with fractions if you would like to. It's just a little bit easier this way. So we're doing row 3, add it to row 2. So notice that this 0 did not change. If we would have changed that 0, then we would have had to went back and done some of the first steps over again. Negative 7 and 8 gives me the 1 that I need. 13 and 2 gives me a 15. And 23 and negative 60 gives me a negative 37. And we got our 1 where we need it. Well, let's now use that 1 to make this a 0 by doing negative 2 times row 2 and add it to row 1. Now let's make this a 0 by doing 7 times row 2 and adding it to row 3. So my second row does not change. And let's use this rule first. Negative 2 times row 2 added to row 1 gives me a 1. Negative 2 and 2 is a 0. Negative 30 and negative 3 is a negative 33. And this will be 74 and a negative 14 gives me a 60. Now let's do this. 7 times row 2, 7 zeros, and add it to 0 would be 0. 7 and negative 7 is 0. 105 and 13. 7 times 15 is 105, and 13 is 118. 7 times negative 37 plus 23 gives me negative 236. And that looks pretty ugly, but something good happens here. When you do 1 over 118 times row 3, things get a little bit better looking. So let's go ahead and leave our first 2 rows the same. And our third row turns into a 0, 0, 1, and actually negative 2. So therefore it does come out nice and neat. Let's now use that 1 to zero out these two. So I'm going to do 33 times row 3, and I'm going to add it to row 1. And I'm going to do negative 15 times row 3, and I'm going to add it to row 2. So row 3 stays the same. And now let's change the other two. 33 times row 3, add it to row 1 gives you a 1, 0, 0. And then 33 times negative 2 is negative 66. And 60 gives you negative 6. Now performing this one would give you a 0, a 1, and a 0. Negative 15 times this gives you a 30. When you add that to negative 37, that gives you a negative 7. So my solution set therefore would be a negative 6, a negative 7, and a negative 2.